Hello everyone. Today we'll discuss about the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. Now first of all, this is the medulla oblongata. Now you may know that in the brainstem we have for the midbrain, pons and medulla. Now this medulla oblongata is the direct upward continuation of the spinal cord extending from the foramen magnum of the skull to the lower border of the pons. Now it forms the lowest part of the brainstem and lies almost vertically in the anterior part of the posterior cranial fossa. Remember, it is present in the anterior part of the posterior cranial fossa between the clivus of the skull bone in front and vallicula of cerebellum behind. Remember, in front of it there will be clivus. What is clivus? Clivus is actually the superior part of or superior surface of the basic occiput. Basic occiput is the part of the occipital bone only in the skull, which is actually present between the foramen magnum somewhat and the sphenoidal bone. Okay, and vallicula of the cerebellum behind. Now this medulla is shaped like a truncated cone, and that's why it is also known as the bulb. And the medulla actually contains the vital centers which are very essential for life. These are basically three: cardiac, vasomotor and the respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata. Now since the medulla oblongata contains the vital center of the brain, so any injury to this particular medulla oblongata will be fatal. The respiratory center is particularly vulnerable to compression and poliomyelitis with subsequent respiratory failure. Now the bulbar paralysis of the bulbar or the medulla oblongata is characterized by the paralysis of the muscle supplied by the last four cranial nerve arising from the medulla. Remember, this medulla oblongata actually gives attachment to the last four cranial nerves, that is the 9, 10, 11, 12. Glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory and the hypoglossal cranial nerve. So any injury or paralysis of this particular medulla oblongata will cause the paralysis of the particular muscle supplied by the last four cranial nerve arising from this particular medulla oblongata. Now this is the anterior view of the medulla oblongata and this is the posterior view of the medulla oblongata. Now the external feature of the medulla oblongata. Now the medulla oblongata is present over here. This is the medulla oblongata. This portion is the medulla oblongata. This is the pons. Okay, so this is the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata is divided into right and left symmetrical halves by anterior median fissure and the posterior view by the posterior median sulcus. This is the posterior median sulcus. Now remember, this is the lower part of the medulla oblongata. Okay, now the lower part of the medulla oblongata, like the spinal cord, contains the central canal, while in the upper part, as you can see in the upper part of this medulla oblongata, in the upper part, this actually widens and moves dorsally to form the lower part of the fourth ventricle. Thus, the medulla oblongata is divided into two main parts: lower closed and upper open part. This is the anterior median fissure. Now, anterior median fissure is continuous below with the corresponding fissure on the spinal cord, and above it ends into a small triangular depression known as the foramen cecum at the lower border of the pons. Okay, this is the pons. The lower border of pons contain the foramen cecum. Now the posterior median sulcus, this is the posterior median sulcus. Now the posterior median sulcus continues below with the corresponding sulcus of the cord and is present only in the lower half of the medulla, not in the upper half. Above the lips, it diverges to form the boundaries of the triangular areas, the lower part of the fourth ventricle of the cerebellum. Now each half of the medulla is marked by two sulci. Remember, which two sulci? First of all, in the middle there is a posterior median sulcus. Okay, while in the each half there is two further sulcus. That is, this is the anterolateral sulcus and this is the posterolateral sulcus, which is directed upward continuous of the corresponding sulci of the cord. Now the anterolateral, this is the anterolateral. The anterolateral sulcus extends along the lateral border of the pyramid and along it merges the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. Now over here it is not visible, but in the anterior part it is visible. So somewhere over here from the posterior part, the anterolateral will come and it will merge with this rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. This is the nerve rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve or the 12th cranial nerve. Now the posterolateral sulcus, these are the posterolateral sulcus and they mainly lies between the olives and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, now what are olives? These are the olives. Contains the inferior olivary nucleus and the cerebral peduncles are this. These are the over here. These are the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now remember, we have basically three cerebral peduncles. That is the superior, middle and the inferior. Superior one is basically present in the midbrain. middle one is basically present in the pons, okay, and the inferior is basically present in the medulla oblongata. So the posterolateral sulcus is basically present between the olives and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And this posterolateral sulcus along it merges to the rootlets of the three nerves, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve and the accessory nerve. Just remember, the anterolateral sulcus will merge with the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve, and the posterolateral sulcus will merge with the rootlets of the glossopharyngeal nerve, vagus nerve and the accessory nerve. Now the anterolateral, this is the anterolateral and the posterior, these both sulcus, the anterolateral and the posterolateral sulcus with nerve roots divide the surface of each half of the medulla oblongata into three further parts. That is the anterior, this is the posterior and this is the lateral. Okay, basically in three parts: anterior, posterior and the lateral part. Now the important features of the anterior aspect of the medulla. Now first of all, this is the medulla and the anterior aspect of this. Okay, now over here, the first of all we have pyramids. Now these are the pyramids. Now these are the two elongated elevation, one on either side of the anterior median fissure. This is the anterior median fissure. So one on each side, and they are mainly produced by the corticospinal or the pyramidal fibers, also known as the corticonuclear fibers. Now most of these fibers in the lower part, okay, mainly in the lower part, most of these fibers, around 75%, cross to the opposite side, forming the pyramidal decussation in the lower part and then descend downwards as lateral corticospinal tract in the lateral right column of the spinal cord. Okay, we discussed about the corticospinal tract in a video of the tract of spinal cord. So over there also we discussed that these pyramidal tracts actually cross each other, okay, and whatever comes down, the decussating fibers comes down, descend down in the spinal cord in the lateral right column of that, that is known as the lateral corticospinal tract, while the uncrossed remaining 20-25% uncrossed fibers descend downwards as anterior corticospinal tract in the lateral right column of the spinal cord. Now next are the olives. These are the, as you can see, these are the olives. Now olives are actually oval elevation posterolateral to the pyramids, and are produced by an underlying mass of grey matter known as the inferior olivary nucleus. Now the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. These are the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve, and these emerge from the anterolateral sulcus. We discussed in the anterolateral sulcus. These are the anterolateral sulcus. So these mainly emerge from the anterolateral sulcus between the pyramid and the olive. So it is basically present between the pyramid and the olives, emerging from the anterolateral sulcus of the posterior view of the medulla. Now the inferior cerebral peduncle, it is basically visible from the anterolateral view. So these are the inferior cerebral peduncle, and these are thick bundle of fiber lying posterolateral to the olives and attach the medulla with the cerebellum. Attaches the medulla with the cerebellum. Now the rootlets of the 9th, 10th and 11th cranial nerves mainly emerge from the posterolateral sulcus, separating the olives from the inferior cerebral peduncles. Now the features of the posterior aspect of the medulla. This is the posterior aspect of the medulla. Now the feature of the closed part. This is the closed part and this is the open part. So first of all, the closed part. Now the closed part on the either side of the posterior median sulcus present three longitudinal elevations from medial to lateral. These are first of all the fasciculus gracilis. This is the fasciculus gracilis. This is the fasciculus cuneatus. And this is the inferior cerebral peduncle. As you can see, this is the inferior cerebral peduncle, mostly visible from the anterolateral part of the olives. Now the upper end of the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus actually expands and form the gracili and the cuneate tubercle. Gracile tubercle and the cuneate tubercle respectively, due to underlying nuclei of the same name. Now another elevation present lateral to the cuneate tubercle. This is the cuneate tubercle. So lateral to this, we are having one more elevation somewhere over here, as you can see over here. This is the lateral elevation, lateral to the cuneate or the cuneate tubercle, and this is known as the tuber cinereum. Tuber cinereum is produced by the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The features of the open part of the medulla oblongata, or the upper part of it. Now it basically forms the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle and represent some features like over here, as you can see, this is the median sulcus. Okay, this is the vagal triangle, this is the hypoglossal triangle, over here this is the area postrema, then this is the vestibular area, This is the stria medullaris. Now to set the internal structures of the open part of the medulla oblongata, we will do the transverse section of it into in the mainly 4 places, that is at the level of the decussation of the pyramids, where the pyramids were decussating in the anterior part if you remember, then at the level of the decussation of the medial lemnisci, at the level of the olives, and at the level just inferior to the pons. Now first of all, transverse section at the level of the decussation of the pyramids. When we will cut the medulla oblongata from this level, we will be able to see some features like this. Okay, now this is also known as the great motor decussation, and the section at this level passes through the inferior half of the medulla and closely resemble to the spinal cord. Now the features of this are, first of all, as you can see, this is the nucleus gracilis and this is the nucleus cuneatus. Now this both appear as a narrow strip like projection from the posterior aspect of the central gray matter. This is the posterior, this is the anterior. Okay, so it actually appears like the narrow strip. Now this is actually the posterior horn of the gray matter of this medulla. Now the apex of the posterior horn gets swollen up to form the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. Now this basically is the upward continuation of the substantia gelatinosa of the spinal cord, basically the posterior gray column of the spinal cord. Now the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, is a bundle of fibers which caps over the nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. Now I told you before that about 75% of fiber actually decussate or from the pyramidal decussation. Now about 75% fibers of the pyramidal tract run backward and laterally across the midline, reaching the lateral white column on the opposite side of the spinal cord, where they run downward as the lateral corticospinal tract. We discussed about this before only. Now in doing so, the anterior horns are detached from the central gray matter. Each detached anterior horn divides to form the spinal nucleus of the accessory nerve and supraspinal nucleus of the first cervical nerve. The nucleus of the accessory nerve extends downwards up to the 5th cervical spinal segment. The supraspinal nucleus gives off the efferent fibers of the first cervical nerve and is continuous above with the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. Now this is the reticular formation. Now what is this? Appearance of diffuse zone containing a network of fibers and scattered nerve cells. Within it, the lateral white column adjacent to the nucleus of the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve is known as the reticular formation. Now next section is at the level of the sensory decussation or at the level of the decussation of the medial lemnisci. Now over here, as you can see, this is the nucleus gracilis and this is the nucleus cuneatus. Now these both nuclei are more pronounced and are separated from the central gray matter. As you can see previously at the level of decussation pyramids, these both were attached to central gray part, right? But over here they both are separate from that particular central gray matter. Now the internal arcuate fiber, these are the internal arcuate fiber, and these fiber arises from the cells of the gracili and the cuneate nuclei, and they mainly course, remember they mainly course forward and medially around the central gray matter, and decussate with the corresponding fibers of the opposite side in the median plane, and then turn upwards to ascend as the medial lemnisci on the opposite side close to the median plane. Now this internal arcuate fiber cut off the spinal nucleus and tract of the trigeminal nerve from the central gray matter. Now as the fibers from the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus pass forward and medially, they intercross so that most of the medial fibers from the leg and the feet come to lie anteriorly in the medial lemniscus. This is the medial lemniscus. Now in the medial lemniscus, the body is represented with the head posteriorly and the feet anteriorly. The fibers of the lemnisci relay in the corresponding thalamus. Now this is the accessory cuneate nucleus. Now immediately dorsolateral to the cuneate nucleus, we have accessory cuneate nucleus, and this accessory cuneate nucleus receives the most lateral fibers of the fasciculus cuneatus and gives rise to posterior external arcuate fibers, conveying the proprioceptive impulse to the cerebellum of the same side, the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now these are the spinal nucleus and the tract of trigeminal nerve. Now the separated spinal nucleus and the tract of trigeminal nerve lies ventrolateral to the cuneate nucleus. So just remember, this accessory cuneate nucleus lies dorsolateral and this spinal nucleus and tract of trigeminal nerve lies ventrolateral to this nucleus cuneatus. Now these are the inferior olivary nucleus, and that to the inferior part or the lower part of the inferior olivary nucleus is seen in this section. Now these are the pyramids which lie on the either side of the anterior median fissure. Now central gray matter, it basically contains, remember, three things over here. That is the hypoglossal nucleus, then the dorsal nucleus of vagus, and the nucleus of tractus solitarius. Now these are the medial longitudinal bundles which actually lies posterior to the medial lemniscus. So at the posterior of this medial lemniscus, we have medial longitudinal bundle. Now it is a small compact tract of nerve fiber which interconnect the 3rd, 4th, 6th, 8th and spinal nucleus of the 10th cranial nerve nuclei. Now next is the spinocerebellar tract. These are the spinocerebellar tracts, and this is the lateral spinothalamic tract. Now they both lie in the anterolateral area of the lateral white column. Now the lateral and the anterior spinothalamic tract are very close to each other and collectively form the spinal lemniscus. Now next is the transverse section at the level of the olives. Now over here, first of all, the gray matter which was present in this area. So now over here the gray matter is spread over the floor of the fourth ventricle and contains the nuclei of the several cranial nerves. So now remember, from the medial to the lateral side, the nucleus are first of all the hypoglossal nucleus, then nucleus intercalatus, then the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, and the vestibular nucleus from the medial to the lateral side. Now next is the nucleus of the tractus solitarius. Now this nucleus of the tractus solitarius lies ventral to the vestibular nucleus. Now next is the nucleus ambiguus. Now this is the nucleus ambiguus, and this basically lies deep within the reticular formation. This is the reticular formation, so lies deep to the reticular formation and gives origin to the motor fibers of 9th, 10th and 11th cranial nerve. Now the either side of the midline, this is the midline. On the either side of the midline or the paramedian region from dorsal to the ventral. Okay, from the dorsal to the ventral, we have further structures, we can say. First of all, this is the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This is the tectospinal tract. And this is the medial lemniscus, and at the most ventral part, we have the pyramidal tracts. Okay, these are the pyramidal or the corticospinal or the corticonuclear tracts. Now the arcuate nucleus, this is the arcuate nucleus, and now these are basically situated on the anteromedial aspect of the pyramids, and they receive fibers from the cerebral cortex and send efferent fibers to the cerebellum of the opposite side through the anterior external arcuate fibers. Now laterally, from the dorsal to the ventral, there lies two prominent structures, and these two prominent structures are first of all this yellow structure. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay. And in the ventral part, we are having this is the inferior olivary nucleus. This inferior cerebellar peduncle occupies the posterolateral part, and this inferior olivary nucleus is the largest mass of the gray matter and forms the most prominent features in the section through the upper part of the medulla. Now next is the transverse section of the medulla, just inferior to the pons or the pontomedullary junction, we can say. Now there are no major changes in the distribution of the gray matter and the white matter in this section from that seen in the section of the medulla over here at the level of the pons. Okay, they are almost same in this both. Now but there are only two changes over here. Now first of all, the lateral vestibular nucleus. Okay, now over here, as you can see, this is the inferior vestibular nucleus. Now in this level, this inferior vestibular nucleus is actually replaced by the lateral vestibular nucleus. And next is the cochlear nucleus. These are the two cochlear nuclei. Okay, the anterior one and the posterior one. Now these two cochlear nuclei at this level are now visible. Now the posterior or the dorsal cochlear nucleus and the ventral or the anterior cochlear nucleus actually lies on the dorsolateral and the ventrolateral aspect of the inferior cerebral peduncle respectively. Now the blood supply of the medulla is first of all two cerebral arteries, anterior and posterior spinal artery, anterior and posterior inferior cerebellar arteries, and the basilar artery. So this was all about the medulla. We'll discuss about the clinical aspect of the medulla and all the brainstem in a further particular video. So hope you understood well. Thank you so much.